Welcome to the Neuroethics Learning Collaborative and to our lecture on free will, responsibility, and brain function. Our lecturer today is Stephen Morse. Stephen is a colleague here at Penn in the law school with a joint appointment in psychiatry. He is not only a lawyer but a licensed clinical psychologist and has written and practiced widely in the areas of forensic psychology, psychiatry, neuroscience, and law. He's also co-director of the MacArthur Law and Neuroscience program, and has many interesting things to tell us about.
We'll find out.
About free will, probably the first of which is ain't no such thing.
Ain't no such thing.
Okay.
But not to worry. Well, thank you all for being here. You have the outline on the board. There are no further slides. Martha may have made a slide of this handout, but you've got it and you can just look at it at your leisure. As I said to a couple of people earlier on, I'm going to be making a very strong claim and showing why it is a very strong claim and why it's false. And just to prove that it's not a straw person, I've got quotes from very eminent people for you. Okay, now, I want you to all help me out with a demonstration. This is something I do over and over again. I want you to help me out. I'm going to give you a signal. The signal is going to be, please do it now. I think I mentioned this when I did the psychiatry talk 2 weeks ago, whatever it was. The task is going to be to raise your non-dominant arm. And the signal is going to be, do it now. So please do it now. Thank you. I just want you to remember that demonstration. This is a demonstration I've probably now done in various audiences 100 times. And here's what I can tell you. It's always professional groups or student groups or the like. By professional groups, lawyers, psychiatrists, psychologists, philosophers, neuroscientists. And what I got was 100% cooperation. And I always get 100% cooperation, except for people off their meds or something of the sort. And I always say thank you. And I do thank you. I'll come back to it. All right, what do I think the task is in neuroscience when we think about questions of responsibility? I think the task of neuroscience is not reductively to explain away our personhood, which is the centerpiece of all thinking, is foundational for all thinking about responsibility, but to explain it. Not to explain it away, but to explain it. And I'll say more about what I mean by that. I think a very practical task for neuroscience is this. As I will describe later on, the law uses folk psychological concepts uniformly. All our criteria for responsibility are folk psychological. There's, as you know in psychology, enormous dispute about the mental furniture. What are intentions? What are beliefs? What are desires? What are plans? What are willings? Et cetera, et cetera. And although there is certainly such a thing as folk psychology, the mental explanation in part of behavior, there is a lot of disagreement about what that mental furniture is. And one of the things that could happen, I said this in the psychiatry lecture a couple of weeks ago, was we could do what I called reflective scientific equilibrium, where we use the neuroscience to help refine the folk psychological concepts, and the folk psychological concepts can actually help refine the neuroscience. Because if you think about what you're doing in cognitive neuro, you're always correlating some activity in the brain with some folk psychological task you're asking people to do. So there is a lot of mutual back scratching that can go on. What I intend to do in this talk is precisely what you see on the board. After getting through the introduction and preliminary assumptions, I'm going to tell you what law and morality's concept of the person is and its implicit psychology, and say why it has to be that psychology and that concept of the person. I'm going to use most of my examples from law just to keep things under control for time, but everything I say about law basically goes for morality as well. I'm going to talk then about the positive criteria for responsibility. By positive, I mean the actual on-the-ground criteria we have. If we look at our practices, we look at our doctrines, these are the ones we are using. I'm going to talk about all those. Then I'm going to actually get to what free will is, or isn't. Then the criterial and foundational role of free will in responsibility judgments. By criterial, I mean, do you actually use free will as a criterion? And foundationally, I mean, even if you don't use it as a criterion, is it an underlying foundation, something we have to make the whole system go, even if we don't actually point to it and make an individual responsibility judgment? And I'm going to tell you it's a total distraction. Then I'm going to get to other distractions in responsibility assessments, and many of which are related to neuroscience. Then I'm going to get to what I consider the really important challenge from neuroscience, even though I'm going to shoot it down, which is the notion that neuroscience shows us we're not really the kinds of creatures we think we are at all. And that is going to produce an extremely profound challenge to law and morals, to all conceptions of responsibility. I don't think it goes through, and I'll be trying to say why. So, some preliminaries. I'm not a dualist. Don't think I am when I talk about mental causation. I believe it's matter up. There's no intelligence down. We don't have minds separate from our bodies, which are somehow in causal relations with it. I do believe, however, we have minds, and as I said before, I think mental states certainly play a partial causal role in explaining behavior, genuinely explaining human behavior. They're not epiphenomenal. They're really part of the causal explanation. So, if you were to ask me how I would explain human behavior, I would describe myself as a multi-field, multi-level explainer, which is if I'm going to give a complete account of human behavior, I'm going to need explanations at the level of biology, I'm going to need explanations at the level of psychology, explanations at the level of sociology, to speak roughly, and at different levels within each of those. So multi-fields and multi-levels. So for instance, a complete explanation, I assume, of human behavior, let's just do the neuro for a second, could be either at the molecular level or it could be at the system level or both. And I'm suggesting both. All right. Now, I'm going to have a number of, how shall we say, skeptical or cautious statements about the relation of neuroscience to morality and law. Do not take these to be a critique of the science of neuroscience or the usefulness of neuroscience. They are not. They're very specifically focused on the use of neuroscience for law and for morality at the present. Here's one thing we have to remember. If your brain is dead, you're dead. So the brain is always going to be part of the explanation, always. If your brain is dead, you're not doing much at all. All right. Let us move on. A couple of more preliminaries, and then I get to the law of psychology and concept of the person. I say, without fear of contradiction, that we don't have a clue how the brain enables the mind. And I have never been in a group of neuroscientists who are actually ever willing to challenge that and show how the brain enables the mind. Many people think, as I said, consciousness is perhaps the hardest problem in all of science. We don't have a clue. We don't have a clue. Nor do we have a clue how action is possible. Now, by action, what I'm going to mean is essentially an intentional bodily movement or an intentional omission. So, for example, I want to do a demonstration. I move my hand like this. Now, why did I move my hand like this? We'd give an action explanation. But suppose I had Huntington's disease and I made a choreiform movement. It had the exact same arc in space. My arm moved exactly the same. We would not say that was my action. Well, what's the difference between the two? We don't have a clue. We have no idea how, when I asked you to get your arms up there, we don't have a clue how your arm gets. Oh, yes, your brain has to be intact, your musculoskeletal system has to be intact, you have to be neurologically intact in the right way. Of course, of course, of course. But we don't know how action is possible. No one does at present. And I defy Martha or anybody else, and I have done this in groups of hundreds of neuroscientists, and they'll say, okay, you're right, yeah, but we're getting there. We're getting there, right? Well, when we get there, there'll be a revolution in biological science. You heard it here first. There'll be a revolution, I think, in our understanding of ourselves, but I don't think we're anywhere close. We might, however. Okay, so we don't know how the brain enables the mind. We don't know how action is possible. Reductionist programs in science generally are everybody's ideal. Let's always take the higher level and reduce it down to the lower level and show that the next higher level is really doing no work. The lower level does it. So finally get down to neurons and even intracellular events, et cetera, et cetera. We haven't been able to work it out for supposedly the easiest intertheoretic reduction of all, the reduction from chemistry to physics. The notion that at this point we can reduce behavior to just neuronal events is a total speculation, And people who assert it confidently, I say, suffer from a disease I have termed neuroarrogance. And you do want to avoid neuroarrogance, which is not to say you shouldn't be very proud of good work you do, but neuroarrogance is in your irrational exuberance phase to make claims for what neuroscience's implications are that you couldn't possibly cash out at present, and you don't even see a bunch of intermediate steps to get there yet. I mean, I'm all for speculation if you can show the steps. You know, here we are, we've come this, now the next step of the project is, ain't nowhere close yet on most of these things. All right, the law's psychology, the law's concept of the person. Here it is in a nutshell. What are we as creatures, and how do we explain ourselves? So, for example, if I were to ask any of you, why did you raise your arm when I asked you to? Part of the explanation you would give, and if I were to do a little Socratic colloquy with most of you, the story would change slightly, but it would be something like this. You desired to get as much out of this lecture as you could. You believe that a well-meaning lecturer who's not threatening you or in any way treating you badly, you believe that that person, if you cooperate with him, will teach you something better. So you have desires, you have beliefs, and you form the intention to cooperate by raising your hand, and you do. That's the kind of explanation you would give. Now, did your brain play a role in that? Of course it did. Of course it did. Did the sociology play a role? Yes. You know, you're all psychology graduate students. You learned enough psychology, even if you did social psych once as an undergraduate, to know there's a powerful situational pop going on here, right? Everybody wants to be seen to be cooperative and friendly and polite and things like that, even if you didn't feel like it or something of the sort. Great. But your intentions that arose from your desires and your beliefs certainly played a role. And so what kind of creature is the kind of creature that acts for reasons? A creature like us. A conscious, self-conscious, potentially rational agent that can be guided by reason. That's who we are. That's what it means, essentially, to be a person in law, and I would put it to you in everyday life. The explanations that you give to yourself all the time when you're being honest with yourself, not when you're being a smart-ass neuroscience and trying to tell stories about your brains, the explanations you give yourself and you give others for why you do what you do are basically folk psychological explanations that depend on you being the kind of creature I just described. Now, other creatures are seemingly proto-intentional. Other creatures are certainly conscious. Other creatures are certainly sentient generally. But to the best of our knowledge, we are the only creatures that can be guided by reason and that act for reasons. Right? We don't see an avian Miss Manners. We don't see chimp legislatures. We don't see porcine police to take a bunch of very intelligent creatures otherwise. Only human beings, to the best of our knowledge, can be guided by reason. We are creatures for whom mental states make a difference in explaining and causing our behavior. Now, there is nothing inconsistent about this explanation with an enormous amount of automaticity in our behavior. My favorite example of this, because it's vivid, is which leg you put through your undershorts first in the morning. You don't think about that. You do it automatically. And frankly, you have no reason to think about it. And if you did start to think about it, you'd never get your shorts on. Why? Because there's no reason to put one leg through versus the other. You'd have to make an existential leap of faith. Today I am just going to take responsibility and put my left leg through. No, you do it automatically. Thank God. But suppose I gave you a very good reason not to. Held a gun at your head and said, put the usual leg through first, I'm going to blow your brains out. You'd figure out how to get that other leg through first. You'd bring reason to bear. All the time. When you have reason to, you do bring reason to bear. And we start to think about people behaving foolishly, what we often think is they didn't bring reason to bear when they should have. Now, why is this folk psychological concept of the person, an agent that can be guided by reason, crucial for law? Well, think about what law is. And now I'm going to be really potted, breathtakingly superficial, as I'm fond of saying. Law is a system of rules that's meant to guide behavior. It's like morality, it's like custom, it's like social norms, mores, and the like. It's meant to guide behavior. It does other things as well. It creates value. Law and morality create value. They're teachers. But it's also meant to be something you can use as a reason in deciding what you have reason to do. Sometimes because you'll be guided by the underlying policy that supports the rule. Sometimes just because you're afraid of the consequences of violating the rule. But law gives you a reason. And what kind of creatures can use reasons? Creatures like ourselves. If law couldn't be action guiding in the way I've just described, it would be incoherent. So would morality. What would be the point? All right, now, moving right along. That, by the way, is something that, at least in my trade, the law's folk psychological concept of the person, a creature capable of being guided by reason through mental states do make a causal explanatory difference. That's pretty much taken for granted. There will be arguments about what exactly the contours of those mental states are and stuff like that, but the basic folk psychological apparatus is considered to be just classically true. Now, I'm going to get to later whether neuroscience suggests to us that it isn't true. All right, what are the positive criteria for responsibility in law? And now I'm just going to talk law. It's going to be the same in morals for all sorts of reasons. First, what are we doing when we are holding people responsible? What I think we're doing is, and now I'm just trying to give you a positive sense of what we are actually doing, we are coming to a considered judgment that this person warrants praise or blame, reward or punishment. Now, there are some people who want to treat those things asymmetrically. Not much turns on that. I want to treat it symmetrically. So we're making a judgment that praise or blame, reward or punishment are warranted just because the person either has conformed to or has violated a social normative expectation we have of them. So, for example, if I started cursing vilely now as part of this lecture, and not just to make a point, I just was really profane and rude to you people, that would be violating a social expectation that you would have of me, that I will be a polite lecturer and not offend anybody by my speech, at least not wittingly. And in a situation like that, you would think that both blame and some kind of sanction or censure would be warranted. That's what we're doing when we hold people responsible. Well, what are the criteria for responsibility? Let me just give you a set of legal criteria for murder. Very, very simple. You have to engage in intentional killing conduct. Any kind of intentional killing conduct will do. Knifing, shooting, poisoning, bludgeoning, nunchakuing, it doesn't matter. You have to have your purpose to kill. The reason you're engaging in that behavior, I could be wielding a knife but not have intentionally wielding a knife and waving it around with no intention of killing anybody. You have to have the purpose to kill somebody. If I engage in killing conduct with the purpose of killing and I kill, that is prima facie homicide, and I am going to be liable unless I have some kind of excusing condition. Now, what kinds of excusing conditions might there be? Well, one, I might be incredibly irrational. So I believe people who are wearing purple tops are Bulgarian agents about to kill me. So I take out my gun and I shoot to kill in the belief that I need to do so to save my own life. I'm legally insane. What's the problem? It's not that I suffer from a mental illness, it's that I don't know what I'm doing. It's a mental state problem. Or someone holds a gun to my head. She holds a gun to my head and says, kill her, or I'll kill you. Coercion. That might be an excusing condition too. Notice what's doing the work. She has placed me in a very hard choice situation, a really hard choice situation. Kill or be killed. And if I kill, which I shouldn't do because she and I are having the same equal bad luck. It's all her fault, but we both have bad luck. Why do I get to unload my bad luck onto another innocent agent? I should take the bullet myself. If I don't, and I do kill her to save my own sorry life, then we might give me an excuse of coercion. But notice what it is. It's a hard choice. There, but for the grace of God, go I. And basically, I've just done all criminal law responsibility for you in a nutshell. You didn't hear free will anywhere in there. Nowhere. It's not part of the prosecution's case ever to prove that a defendant has free will. It's not part of the defense case to prove that he doesn't or she doesn't have free will. Prosecution's got to prove you intentionally violated some social norm, essentially, and the defense is going to have to come up with some folk psychological kind of excusing condition, like I was irrational or I was compelled. And notice what compelled is in the example I gave of hard choice. No one forced my arm. That's literal compulsion. It was certainly my action to shoot her to save my own life. I desired to live. I believed if I killed her, I would live. I formed the intention to kill her, and I did. Folks' psychological sense of hard choice. All right? So, notice that the criteria for responsibility are all folk psychological. Actions, intentions, beliefs, and the like. Nothing about the brain, nothing about the nervous system, nothing about free will. All right, now, the meaning of free will. This is something people have been arguing about forever, and there is no quote-unquote consensus about it. But roughly, what I think we mean by free will, when we're talking about metaphysical libertarian free will, is your ability to act uncaused by anything other than yourself. Now, that is not entirely unconstrained, right? If you grow up in 13th century southern India, in the Kola kingdom, you're going to have different materials to work with in deciding what to do than if you're living in Philadelphia in 2010. But within the materials available to you, the buck stops with you, the agent. It's a godlike power, the ability to act uncaused by anything but yourself. Sometimes called contra-causal freedom. It's sometimes called agent origination. It's got lots of names. Right? Now, where does that fit in to free will as a potential foundational concept in criminal law? Well, you're all probably aware of the dispute that you followed in college on, gee, if determinism is true, how can anyone be responsible for anything? After all, if determinism is true, basically the first event in the universe plus the causal laws then caused an unfolding of one event after another in a totally mechanistic clockwork orange. That's good enough for government work determinism. And if that is so, everything about us, including our characters, our thoughts, our desires, our beliefs, our actions, everything is determined. And if that is so, how could anybody be responsible? How could we ever say about anybody, you deserve praise or blame? You deserve punishment or reward. How could that be fair? Well, I don't know how many of you have a background in philosophy, but there are basically, on that issue, there are three competing schools. Incompatibilism, which comes in two varieties, two flavors, and compatibilism, which really comes in one. The incompatibilist says, if determinism is true, we cannot be responsible. That's the broad heading. Flavor number one, metaphysical libertarianism. I'm an incompatibilist, says the metaphysical libertarian, but I have contra-causal freedom as to human action of normal adults. We're not determined. The buck stops with us. We are actually contra-causally free. Now, in this room, I suspect that we all think that's poppycock, that it's literally preposterous, but okay, there are people out there who believe that. Then there are people called the hard determinists. What they believe is, if determinism is true, we can't be responsible. We, like everything else in the universe, are determined, and therefore none of us is responsible. That isn't necessarily poppycock, in my view. But then there is a third view, which is called compatibilism, which says, even if determinism is true, we can nonetheless be responsible. because responsibility does not require contra-causal freedom. It doesn't require us to be agents unmoved by anything but ourselves. It is enough. It is enough for responsibility on a compatibilist view if, in fact, we are capable of doing what we want and we are capable of deliberating and being guided by reason. Now, there are many different strands of compatibilism. I don't want to argue for any particular one, but simply what they all have in common is the view that as long as we can do what we want and we are unconstrained, we can, in fact, be held responsible. That is enough of a human capacity for responsibility here on Earth. Now, I need to make a distinction for you, and that's between determinism and fatalism. And this is a really important one because they're often confused. Determinism is, again, the view that all events in the universe have a causal explanation that depends on previous states of the universe plus the causal laws operating on those states. So fatalism is the view that our deliberations don't matter. Now, here's how you can see the distinction. And it's just a very simple little thought experiment that I borrow from Daniel Dennett, who I know is familiar to most of you. Imagine you're standing on the edge of your building. You're thinking about whether you should jump off and kill yourself. On the one hand, I'm in great psychological pain. Maybe I'm in great physical pain. I don't see any way out. It would be a rational thing to do to end my life now, and I can't think of any other way to do it. But on the other hand, my family will be so upset, I'll make a mess on the sidewalk, my family will be impoverished, and various other things like that. And you deliberate, and you deliberate. And then finally you jump, because you decide, all things considered, I think I should jump. And you jump. Now you're passing the 23rd story on your way down to the ground, and you start to have second thoughts. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. Deliberate all you want. It's going to be Splatsville in about a few seconds. That's fatalism, where your deliberations don't matter. But what you know is your deliberations do matter. When you got the letter from the Penn Department of Psychology, and you got it from, who's our best competitor? Princeton. You know, should I go to Princeton or should I go to Penn? On the one hand, there's money here, but on the other hand, there's prestige there. I'll leave it up to you to decide which is which. And stuff like, you know, your deliberations. Now, about a lot of things, why deliberate? Why deliberate about which leg to put through your shorts first in the morning? Okay, so now what I want to tell you is all our doctrines of responsibility that I've talked about are totally compatible with the truth of determinism. So remember I said you have to have an intentional action of some sort. Well, some people act and some people have muscular spasms or neuromuscular reflexes or something of the sort. Some people form the intent to kill, some people don't. They make mistakes. Some people are crazy, most people are not when they do bad things. Some people do bad things because someone's holding a gun to their head, most people are not acting with guns at their heads, right? All those things are true even if determinism is true. Now think about your judgments about when you are warranted in holding someone responsible. Warranted, that is, in praising or blaming, punishing or rewarding. It's going to be totally consistent to have these distinctions we make in law and morality with moral theories we have good reason to endorse, that take people seriously as people, that treat us with dignity and respect, and with good consequences. I mean, what can I do to stop people from having neuromuscular spasms, at least the first time they have them, where it was unpredictable? What would be the point ever of punishing such a person for doing that? So what I'm suggesting to you is, if you adopt a compatibilist reading of the free will determinism debate, free will not only becomes irrelevant as a criterion for any responsibility judgment, it's also not even foundational. And given that we have good reason to endorse the moral theories that we do use in law and morality, both consequential and deontological, why would we give them up on some speculative hypothesis about whether determinism metaphysically and responsibility are incompatible or not? It just would not make a whole lot of sense to do. The game isn't over, by the way, because we're going to get to the disappearing person. I'll get there real quickly now. Okay, what are some other distractions? So essentially what I'm telling you is I believe we don't have free will in the sense of strong causal freedom. It doesn't worry me for responsibility because we can have compatibilist responsibility, and that's entirely consistent with the positive doctrines of law we see today. So free will not criterial, free will not foundational. Causation is also not an excusing condition. Just because there is a cause for behavior, this is a related point, just because there is a cause for behavior doesn't mean you're not responsible for the behavior. So now let's go back to the example again. When you raised your non-dominant arm because I asked you to do it, it was certainly intentional action on your part. You had a true purpose to raise your non-dominant arm to cooperate. It wasn't irrational of you, and no one forced you. So perfectly fine to say thank you. You deserve my thanks. You didn't deserve, my going crazy. It wasn't that big a deal what you did, but you deserved a thank you in proportion to the degree to which you cooperated. Okay, fair enough. That's easy enough to do. But how about the causation of it? Does anyone here think that that was not caused behavior on your part? We can give a full causal explanation. We don't have the ability to do it, but at least in principle we could give a full causal explanation. Does that mean you weren't responsible? You didn't deserve the thank you? There's always a cause. If causation were an excusing condition per se, no one would ever be responsible for anything. Or everyone would be. We could flip it and just say, since everyone's caused and we want to have responsibility, causation never excuses. Well, causation doesn't per se excuse, even if we can point to an abnormal, let's assume brain-based cause for why someone does what they do. Here's my example. Take a burglar, someone who does burglary for a living, who only does burglary when he is clinically hypomanic. And when I say clinically hypomanic, I mean diagnosable, we can code him, we can get insurance reimbursement, because that, of course, is the real test for whether you're sick or not. Now, why does he only do his burglaries when he's hypomanic? Because only when he's hypomanic does he feel the sense of self-confidence and energy it takes to do burglary, which is dangerous. It's anxiety-provoking, and if you're feeling more confident, more energetic, you're more likely to do it. He wouldn't do it except for being hypomanic. And let's assume we could even show what neurotransmitter glitch is responsible for the hypomania. Is he responsible? Probably he is. Why? Because even though he's hypomanic, he's a little bit higher in his self-confidence and his energy than is warranted. He's still not sufficiently irrational, and no one's forcing him. So there's no excusing condition present, even though he's caused by a brain glitch. You always have to ask, what is the folk psychological excusing condition that is present? Causation can't be it. Next, causation is not compulsion. Nobody compelled you to raise your non-dominant arms. You were not in a hard choice situation. Yes, there was a strong social pull to do it, yes. Certainly politesse and being a good weenie, that's why you're here in the room. We're all good weenies, right? Or we wouldn't be in rooms like this. All these things make a difference. But ultimately, if you didn't want to raise your hand, you didn't have to. I didn't threaten you in any way. So there was no hard choice there whatsoever, not really. Okay, now the disappearing person challenge. This is where I want to end, because I told Martha I try to keep it to 40-45 minutes. This is a really serious challenge. Now what I've given you is, I've given you this handout. One from the conclusion of Daniel Wegner, probably familiar to many of you, professor of psychology at Harvard, very widely noted book, 2002, The Illusion of Conscious Will. That's the conclusion. And on the other side of the page is a claim by Josh Green, who is a Princeton-trained philosopher who also then got trained in neuroscience and is now assistant professor of psychology at Harvard, and Jonathan Cohn, a neuroscientist at Princeton. So we have here extremely well-trained, extremely thoughtful people who in their own way are making the claim that your mental states do not make a difference. They are an illusion. You have mental states, we think, but they don't make a difference in explaining your behavior. Folk psychology, in other words, is an illusion. So I call this the disappearing person, and compatibilism won't save you if this challenge worries you. What I've been saying so far is there's nothing in neuroscience as the newest determinism on the block that causes any new challenge to responsibility. It's no different from genetics. It's no different from behavioral psychology. It's no different from social structural analysis of the Chicago school sort. Determinism is determinism is determinism. There are the compatibilist answers to determinism. If the disappearing person claimants are correct, however, then responsibility goes out the window. Here's why. All our responsibility concepts depend on the truth of folk psychology. They depend on us being the sorts of people who can be guided by reason, who can be responsible for violating or conforming to a social expectation, for whom mental states matter. I mean, it makes all the difference in the world to you if someone bumps into you by total accident versus someone hits you intentionally. As Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes of the United States Supreme Court back in the late 19th and early 20th century said famously in his book on the paths of the law, even a dog knows the difference between being stumbled over and being kicked. Well, what if mental states really are, and here's the jargon words probably familiar to most of you, epiphenomenal? They really do no work. In other words, mental states are a little bit like our appendixes. Just think of your mind as a mental appendix. It's there, somehow evolution has thrown it off, but it's doing no work. So when you give a mental state explanation of your own behavior or the behavior of others, it's all just an illusion. If that's true, all our responsibility concepts go by the by. They're gone. And the reason compatibilism doesn't save you is this. Compatibilism assumes the truth of folk psychology. It assumes the truth of mental causation. If determinism is true, however, remember the compatibilist believes determinism or something like it is true. Two states of the world are possible. It's an empirical question. One, our mental states matter. Two, our mental states don't. So compatibilism doesn't save you here anymore because compatibilism assumes the truth. It begs the question against the disappearing person view. So everything depends on whether the disappearing person view is true. And Martha, should I go to 6? Because I can finish this, I think, in 10 minutes. Yeah. All right. I know I'm rushing, but I want to give you folks a chance to have at. I claim that there are two different types of evidence for the truth of the disappearing person claim, the indirect evidence and the direct evidence. I'm going to go through these quickly. You're psychologists. You're quite familiar with most of these. The first is the undoubted truth that we often have no idea why we do what we do. We're not aware of the causes of our action. Sometimes we're not even aware of our internal subjective motives for action. We just act. That's true. It's undoubtedly true. Does that mean when we act, we're not conscious, not potentially guided by reason? It's just a non sequitur to think from the fact that we don't know why we do what we do, we're not conscious, intentional in when we do it. So let me give you an example. You're all probably familiar with the old experiments where you take theology students because you really want to trick up the experiment. And what you do, they don't know their subjects, and they're basically randomized to, they have an important meeting they've got to get to, and you set up the situation that they pass somebody who really needs their aid. Some of them are told they're late, and some of them are told they have plenty of time. And guess what you find out? Those who think they're late to this really important meeting do not render the beneficent aid that morality would tell any of us to render. And they're not aware that it's their being late to an important meeting. You know, they come up with rationalizations for why they didn't do what they clearly had a duty to do. Well, they had a duty to do it, and they failed in that duty, even though they didn't know it. And I'm perfectly willing to blame the little suckers for it, even if they are theology graduate students. Right? Second of all, what Killstrom calls the automaticity juggernaut. This is the second kind of indirect evidence. God, there's automaticity everywhere. I'll give you an example of automaticity. I just might move my arms like that. I can assure you that was an automatic bodily movement. And I did not go through the following syllogism, practical syllogism. I desire to make a point. I believe if I move my arms, that will energize the room a little bit, and therefore you will likely to remember what I'm saying, and therefore I intentionally move my arms in that way. Of course not. It was automatic. Yes, of course there's a lot of behavior that's automatic. And we also know that if you suffer from certain kinds of brain lesions, that there are going to be other kinds of automaticity. Does the fact that brain lesions can cause automaticity mean that you're no different from brain lesion people? Does the fact that you have a lot of automatic behavior mean you're always automatic? Of course not. Here's what I can tell you. As automatic as my pacing is, I was taught very early on in my career as a lecturer, move. Move your body, move your hands. You know, that will get the energy level up in the room. People are more likely. So I now do it entirely automatically. But as I'm fond of saying, if on my student evaluations they ever said, you know, Morse is too hyperkinetic, he ought to move less, it's really interfering with my learning, I'd stop, because then I would have good reason to. As I'm fond of saying, when my daughter, who said, you know, use the verbal stool softener of like, I'm like, she's like, he's like, all the time in high school. I broke her of that habit, at least at home. And if I could break her of that, we can break people of any automaticity. All right? Third kind, and by the way, I say hooray for automaticity. Thank God. Can you imagine if we had to use our desire, belief, syllogisms to do every last thing we did? Okay. You're all familiar with the experiments where we can deceive unsuspecting, and it's always the psychology of the undergraduate, right? We can deceive unsuspecting undergraduates into believing that their intentions are causing their bodily movement when they're not. Or we can deceive them into not seeing things that are right in front of their eyes and things like that by giving them particular kinds of instructions, right? All right. What we can show is there can be a disconnect between people's belief about what their intentions are doing and what they're really doing if they're deceived in a laboratory. Well, which do you think is the default for human life? We're all being deceived all the time, or we're not? If you're thinking about ourselves as the product of evolution, obviously non-deceit is going to be the default. We're not being deceived all the time about our effects in the world. We'd be totally, totally ineffective agents and would have been selected out long ago. We'd all not be here if that were the case. Well, the last thing is, how about all this wonderful localization evidence? We now can show that, gee, when you decide to buy, one part of the brain activates against base rate. When you decide not to buy, a different part activates. I'm talking about Brian Knutson's wonderful study from 2007 in Neuron, a real beauty, really well done neuroscience. Does that mean we're just brains in a mall? Does that mean when we don't buy? Of course there's going to be some localization. It could have turned out to be the opposite, right? It could have turned out that the whole brain is recruited for every discrete cognitive process there is. That turned out not to be the case. So what? Of course there's brain activation when you do things. Who would believe otherwise? Your brain is dead, you're dead. Of course there's brain causation and brain activation. So what? Does that mean we're not conscious, intentional, and rational agents? Doesn't follow. Well, what's the direct evidence? Libet. Always Libet. Libet the industry. You're all familiar with the Libet studies? Or yes or no? All right. Here's the really short form. And there have been a lot of studies like this. And I'm going to assume the science is good enough that there's no artifact. There are some people who think there are artifacts. I'm willing to go with the science. Here's the setup. We hook up an EEG to your supplemental motor area. Assume I'm a right-handed person. We hook it up to the left-hand side. And now what we do is we put a subject in front of a big clock, essentially. And here's the experimental task. When you feel like it, for no good reason, none whatsoever, either raise a finger, and sometimes it's flex your wrist. That's it. And here's what we discover when we do that. And then we ask the subject, when did you become aware of the intention to raise your finger or flex your wrist? And we can obviously measure when there was a readiness potential in the supplemental motor area, and we can measure when, in fact, the person actually did flex their wrist to raise their finger. What do we discover? You get a readiness potential in the supplemental motor area about 550 milliseconds before the action actually occurs, and about 400 seconds, 300, 400 milliseconds before the person even becomes aware of the intention. So there's this 300 to 400 millisecond gap between activation in the supplemental motor area and the awareness of the intention. Ah, say the Lebedians, this proves your brain has decided. Brains don't decide anything. People decide. Brains just neurophysiologically transform. Even if the whole causal sequence begins with brain activation, and we don't know that, by the way. For all we know, the way we should be individuating this whole series of events is when the person first forms the intention to take part in the experiment and to cooperate with the experimenter. When should we have started the readings? Right? Okay, but let's even assume there's always brain activation that comes first. Does that necessarily mean that your mental state played no role? Maybe they're both necessary and neither is sufficient. I mean, we don't know. Neuroarrogance to think that we do, but nothing flows from this study to suggest that mental states don't make a difference. So this is by no means a demonstration that, quote unquote, we don't have free will, our intentions make no difference, the brain does it all. It just doesn't follow. Now, what's the evidence against? And here I got a whole list of things, much of which will be familiar to you. As I'm fond of saying to my law students, don't leave your common sense at the door. What kind of story would you need to be told such that you would think you were well warranted in believing, and note what belief is, it's a mental state, that you were warranted in believing that your mental states don't do any work? I mean, the common sense is they do work. Here's another reason to think this is unlikely. Think about what is the neurological basis. Let's just take neuronal events. Let's just talk at the level of neurons for a minute. Think about what it means to have mental states. Mental states are propositional. They're always about something. You desire something. You believe something. You intend something. Moreover, you as conscious, intentional creatures have a sense of temporality. You've got a sense of past, you've got a sense of present, you have a sense of future, and those make a vast difference to your deciding what to do. Now, neurons are not about anything. They're not propositional. They have no sense of temporality. How do we get all this propositional intentionality, and how is it that we have a sense of temporality? How do these things happen? My view is, again, task of neuroscience, not to explain that away, it's to explain how this 2 to 3 pound chunk of white and gray jelly does that miraculous thing. We're going to be working on that for a long time, by the way. Third, imagine if we didn't have a theory of mind. That is, imagine if we didn't, as creatures, have the ability to read the intentions of others, to understand that others have different minds from us and others have different intentions from us. How would cooperative social life be possible? Indeed, what do we know about people with certain kinds of psychiatric disorders who do not have an adequate theory of mind, such as people with autism? We know about them is they are incredibly defective socially, incredibly ineffective. We think that they are lesioned in a certain way and that they need to be helped and fixed, and they do if we can. Next, we know now experimentally, at least based on one good paper in Science in 2007, that the ability to read intentions has been present in primates, not just for our closest relatives, the chimps, the bonobos, and the gorillas, but it's in New World monkeys who split off from us 40 million years ago. So the ability to have a quote-unquote theory of mind to read intentions has been conserved in evolution for 40 million years. Is it likely that it's doing no work? My answer would be it's unlikely that it's doing no work. Next. It's obviously very evolutionarily expensive. I mean, mental states, brain uses 20% of your energy. Why would we have all this expensive mental state stuff that means so much to us if it's doing no work? Moreover, as you all know, you're psychologists, there's actually a ton of laboratory psychology to show that intentions do matter. Folks, psychology is not a toy psychology. It's not a primitive psychology. It's who we are. Now, here's the best reason at present to reject the disappearing person. The disappearing person view is our reasons don't matter. Right? That's what it means. We're just victims of neuronal circumstances, to quote Josh Green and Jonathan Cohn. We're just victims of neuronal circumstances. Our reasons don't matter. If our reasons don't matter, you have no reason to do anything. None. There is no basis for normative life together, for deciding how we should live together, what we have reason to do. What do? Are you going to sit and wait for determinism to happen? Sit and wait for your neurons to tell you what to do? No. You are a deliberative creature. That is who you have evolved to be. And you are going to deliberate. And until the doctor comes and shows us all this is a grand illusion, and the doctor ain't anywhere close. His plane has been detained on Venus, right? I think our responsibility concepts are at present very secure. Now, let me just say a word about Adrian Raine, and then I'll conclude for future prospects. What Adrian is in the business of doing, and does it about as well as anybody, is coming up with partial biological explanations for why people engage in criminal and otherwise antisocial behavior. And as far as I'm concerned, he does an excellent job of it most of the time. He's a good scientist. But if you think about what I have been telling you, what his job has got to be, or anyone like him has got to be, is to take the neuroscience or other biological sciences he's using, like genetics or whatever, and to translate that into the law's folk psychological criteria. He's got to show how it is that some particular biological finding somehow negates or undermines or diminishes the folk psychological criteria we're using. That's always the job. And free will is not a continuum concept. If you're talking about metaphysical free will, we either have it or we don't. Rationality is a continuum concept. We can talk about more or less. The ability to control yourself, that's a more or less. Are you a psychopath? That's a more or a less. It's a continuum. Free will is not a continuum concept. You either have it or you don't. And I believe it's preposterous to think we have it, but there are metaphysical libertarians out there. So what are the prospects for the future? Well, these days everybody's gaga about neuroscience. It's the newest science on the block. It's great stuff because you got all these pretty pictures and stuff like that. Here's my prediction. My prediction is you're going to have the same sort of outcome for law and morals we've had with genetics. People thought it was going to make a huge difference to our moral and legal practices, and it hasn't. It has added things, but there's been no revolutionary re-understanding of what we should be doing. I think the same is going to be true of neuroscience. I think it has great potential, as I said, to help us refine and clarify our concepts, but it's not going to replace them, at least not yet. End of sermon.